All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Wednesday session, I guess. Thank you for everyone who is able to change your schedule to allow us to meet on Wednesdays, so it would afford other folks the opportunity to attend the professional development workshop on Monday. I wasn't there, but I hope it was helpful. And you can always give feedback to Dr. Butts about what was good and perhaps anything that did not work well. So I'm glad for those of you who were able to attend that you were able to take part in that. Tonight, our topic obviously is administrative aspects of federalism. Last week, we focused on grants. This in fiscal federalism. This week, we're going to turn our attention to administrative aspects, which means we're going to talk primarily tonight about mandates, administrative regulations, administrative agreements, and ways in which federal, state, and local governments sometimes work with each other and bargain in order to try and accomplish oftentimes those national objectives. Before we get into tonight, though, just as a reminder, you have another Beach Board essay that is due next Sunday. That one looks at negotiation and asks that you select one example of an intergovernmental negotiation or bargaining that you're familiar with, and talk a little bit about who is involved in that bargaining, what the bargaining was over, and then what the result, the outcome of that bargaining ended up being. So that's your next Beach Board post. Tonight, for our articles, we've said the administrative aspects articles, plus we're also going to reach back and pick up the Moneypenny article from the fiscal topic for last week. I'll be doing the Moneypenny article, so I thought we'd start with that very briefly, and I'll only do maybe 10 minutes or so on Moneypenny. Then our schedule for the remainder of the evening, we have Kamara, who's doing techniques of intergovernmental relations. Then we'll go to Coral, who's doing 10th commandments. Then we have Christina, who's doing another look at bargaining. And then the politics of unfunded mandates is Bernie's article, but because of some scheduling conflicts, Bernie will have to move that to next week. So for tonight, we really only have 4 articles. So tonight might be kind of a short night, but next week and next Saturday, we have a very full agenda. I believe we have 12 or 13 articles left to cover next Monday, as well as in our Saturday session. So we're going to have to really adhere to that 30-minute limit in terms of the discussions. Probably schedule 6 of the articles for next Monday, and then the remaining 6 or 7 articles then for our Saturday morning session. So a very, very full agenda. I also noticed there, when I logged into the Beach Board site, there are 3 article critiques that came in between the last time I logged in and a few minutes ago. So I'll get to those tonight and get some feedback to you on those tonight. Again, if you haven't turned any article critiques yet, you really want to think about doing that ASAP, because as you all know, you have to have the article critique turned in before you discuss that article in class. So just be very mindful of getting those critiques in as quickly as you can. Okay. Well, then, without further ado, let me just do the Moneypenny article really quickly. I know Kamara has asked to go first tonight. But let me just squeeze in Moneypenny, just 10 minutes or so, if that, on Moneypenny, just to kind of wrap up our discussion of fiscal federalism and grants and aid. Because a lot of the themes of the Moneypenny article are themes that we were exposed to in some of the other articles that we discussed for last week. There really can't be a better last name for an author for a fiscal federalism article than Moneypenny. He's really appropriate for this type of a topic. But I really enjoy the Moneypenny article because Moneypenny uses a logical type of philosophical approach known as the straw man approach. And the way in which Moneypenny does it is he sets up all these straw men, so to speak, all of these different explanations for why we have the grants and aid program that we have in our system of American federalism. But the straw men that he sets up, all these explanations, are explanations that he knows are not 100% correct. And he knows they're not sufficient explanations. There's a grain of truth to each of them, but they're not really the most prominent explanation for why we have the system of grants and aid that we have. So Moneypenny offers up to us explanations such as, well, we have federal grants and aid because the federal government wants to equalize abilities between different state and local governments. So you would think if the purpose of federal grants was to try and equalize between different state and local governments, there would be a prominent equalization factor in all of these federal grant programs. But the truth of the matter is, according to Moneypenny, is many of them don't have these equalization types of factors in them. If you're going to have an equalization type of approach, you're probably going to have some type of a formulaic granting of the money. And you'll have to design that formula so that governments with less of a capacity to raise revenue or with less quality or number of services, those would be the governments that would get more money out of this federal grant program if it truly was being done for equalization. So I said that doesn't really hold a whole lot of water. So he moves on to another straw man. And another straw man he looks at is he said, well, they're meant to try and achieve a national objective. They're meant to try and get state and local governments to buy into and achieve this national objective. Well, on kind of an esoteric level, he says, well, what is a national objective? It's kind of hard for us to come to agreement on what is a national objective to begin with. So it's then difficult for us to say, well, yes, these federal grants are all geared toward these objectives that have been defined as being national in scope. Well, here's another straw man. They're used to try and stimulate state and local government involvement and state and local government activity. He says, well, not always. And if you look at it, oftentimes it's the state government or local government that is being innovative and is trying something new. And then the federal government sees that it's working and then decides to incorporate that into federal policy, decides to incorporate that into an approach that should be used across the entire country. You saw that with welfare reform in the state of Wisconsin. You saw that with Medicaid reform in the state of Oregon. You saw that with healthcare reform in the state of Massachusetts. So there's really not much of a need to stimulate state and local government creativity. They're already pretty darn creative themselves. They're kind of what we've always called the laboratories of democracy. So he says, well, maybe another reason for federal grants today is because state and local governments have difficulty raising revenue. Well, he says that's not really true either. In some respects it is, but there are a lot of state and local governments that don't or shouldn't have trouble raising revenue. So if you look at the state and local governments that are in most need, especially at the local level, those local cities oftentimes have the highest concentrations of wealth. So they actually have very large tax capacities, but they have lower levels of tax effort. So I said that's, again, just an explanation that doesn't hold a whole lot of water. Then he makes another argument that is very much of a strawman argument where he says, well, there's greater competence, greater administrative competence at the federal level. And I think he finds that to be almost laughable. So then there's another straw man he sets up. It's the expenditure without responsibility. That's a way in which the federal government can spend this money and claim credit for spending this money without having to be responsible for the results that come out of these federal grant programs, because they're able to hand them over to the states and they're able to shift responsibility and accountability over to state and local governments. He says what really makes more sense and what holds a whole lot more water is that grants and aid, especially categorical grants, fit our system of American federalism very well. And it fits our system of American federalism well for a variety of reasons. One reason is the way in which laws are made in Congress. In order to get something through Congress, you need to have the support enough to get a majority of members of the House and the majority of members of the Senate. Obviously, we don't have as much cohesion that we need in order to get very specific policy goals accomplished. So instead of attacking it through a policy lens, we attack the issues through the lens of money. We attack it through grants, because people are much more likely to buy into and sign off on grants than they are to sign off on these huge policy types of innovations and huge policy types of changes. And so it just kind of matches the way in which Congress works. We talked last week about the specialization that has occurred with these subcommittees in Congress. We talked about the Hansen amendments and the Stevenson amendments, Hansen amendments in the House, Stevenson amendments in the Senate, that created this subcommittee Bill of Rights. And so these subcommittees have their own jurisdictions, and as such, they have these much more power and much more interest in these specific issues that then can lead to the creation of more specific grants, such as these categorical grants. You've got all these interest groups that are involved in our system of social pluralism. when you have this pluralistic approach to decision making where interest groups all have a say or the ability to have a say, then it makes sense that you can placate these groups with all these different categorical grant programs, very specific types of programs, in order to try and placate the needs of all these individual interest groups. For a grant and aid program to get through Congress, you need a much looser coalition than you would to get a piece of legislation through Congress that would be a holistic change to policy approaches. So grant programs kind of reflect a piecemeal approach that can be accomplished with the loose coalitions that we tend to generate in our system of American federalism. But I think what really sums up Moneypenny's argument really well is at the bottom of page 185, I think it's the last paragraph in this article, where Moneypenny says the grant and aid system is by no means an undermining of federalism, but rather a refinement of it. It corresponds to a pragmatic pluralism, which has long been remarked as a characteristic of politics in the United States. It has built into it the characteristically different policy tendencies of states and the national government. It is scarcely a means of enforcing similarity between them. Although direct administration by either government would have the advantage of political administrative clarity and consistency, the choice of federal aid schemes as alternative to either is sufficient evidence that these simpler measures were not a practical means for the attainment of political objectives, whose achievement was only possible if they were not too minutely specified. Essentially what he says is, we shouldn't be surprised about these grants and aid programs. Grants and aid, especially categorical grants, they're not a perversion of American federalism. They're a refinement of American federalism. And we get them primarily because of political reasons. And so the reason why we have these types of grant programs is primarily political and primarily due to the way in which our pluralistic system of decision-making works. It's an important article because it really does tie together 2 weeks. It ties together 2 weeks ago when we talked about political aspects of federalism with what we talked about last week with these fiscal aspects in grant programs. And so it's a really nice way to kind of sum up what we talked about last week by tying the last 2 weeks together very neatly. Okay. I did that in about 10 minutes, like I promised, but again, I just think it's a really important article for us to have exposure to. And so that's why I thought it was interesting for us to talk about it briefly, and also a good way to sum up what we talked about last week. That then allows us to jump off into our next topic, which is administrative aspects of federalism. So as I said, the first article we'll do tonight is tomorrow's article, The Techniques of Intergovernmental Relations. So I'll turn the floor over to you. I've got it open for screen sharing if you want to share your screen, and we'll be off and running with Techniques of Intergovernmental Relations.
Awesome, thank you. Let me share my screen. Can you all see?
Yes,
see a PowerPoint?
Good. Yep, looks good.
Do you guys see my notes on the slide?
No.
Okay, beautiful. Okay, so yes, my name is Kamar Bialugi, and I'll be doing, I'll be expanding on the article, The Techniques of Intergovernmental Relations. This is an article critique by the U.S. Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. Let's see here. Okay, so the agenda today, this is a fairly short article. I'll give you a brief background of the ACIR. The main thing is going to be the national government's 4 major strategies, a small synopsis after that, and personal interactions with those 4 major strategies, and then have a couple questions for the class. So just keep that in mind. Sorry, I have to keep switching over. So let's see. Okay, yes, so the U.S. Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. It is a bipartisan agency assembled by the federal government to examine and survey the intergovernmental relationships between all levels of government, while identifying beneficial tools and strategies to promote a better balance of government. The commission was established back in 1959. It was made of 26 members. These included 6 members of Congress, 4 governors, 3 state legislators, 4 mayors, 3 county officials, 3 private citizens, and 3 representatives of the federal executive branch. And those last ones were appointed by the House, the Senate, and the president. But as you can tell, they were pretty, they had a large attempt on trying to be diverse with the commission, with all levels of government. And unfortunately, this was defunded in 1996. Let's see. But the article we'll be talking about today, the techniques of intergovernmental relationships, the intergovernmental regulations, ACIR expounds on the framework of federal policies and regulatory standards being administered from the national level to the lower levels of government. These techniques are often tethered with financial implementations to encourage acceptance of national mandates. So we will be diving into the 4 techniques. As you can see here, 4 techniques are, let's see here, what's my notes here? Sorry, so the four techniques: direct order, cross-cutting requirements, crossover sanctions, and partial preemption. The gentleman in the middle is representing the federal government. These techniques represent the federal government's carrot-stick approach in regulating state and local jurisdictions and providing incentive for lower agencies to comply to certain mandates. Okay, so the first one we'll dive into is the direct orders. One of the rare but more direct strategy approaches taken by the federal government is in the form of a direct legal order. Direct orders are mandates that must be complied. These orders are typically seen in the public employment environment protection arena and the protection of civil rights. The Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972 and the EPA's Clean Air Act were both under direct orders. The ACIR, though, has been very critical of the federal government's use of direct orders, stating that it continues to blur the lines of responsibility between the federal, state, and local governments. In another article by the ACIR called "The Role of Federal Mandates in Intergovernmental Relations," they stated, quote, "The mandate issues examined in the report arose because American federalism no longer clearly has defined responsibilities for federal, state, and local governments. One result of this lack of defined role has been increased federal involvement in activities historically considered to be state and local affairs. Federal involvement usually begins with financial aid to achieve national goals, but in recent years, the federal involvement has taken the form of direct orders to meet federal requirements, often with no federal financial assistance. This was back in 1996 that they were digressing on this critique. Now, a more recent example of the federal government's utilizing its powers through direct orders comes from the Obama administration. The LGBTQ individuals were seen as a liability after World War II during the Red Scare. Many feared communists would blackmail LGBTQ workers into government secrets, since homosexuality was considered a crime back in the 1950s. President Eisenhower enforced LGBTQ discrimination policies through his executive order. As any individual identified as, in quotes, sexual perversion could be fired or rejected from any civil service employment. Now that was recently rectified in only 2017, I believe. President Obama's direct order in its Executive Order 13764, amending the civil services rules, restoring the civil rights of members of the LGBTQ community. So there's a couple examples of direct order, literally on both ends of the spectrums, one taking away rights and one instilling rights. Now on the cross-cutting requirements. Cross-cutting requirements are one of the more common approaches the federal government utilizes for the implementation of their regulations. The strategy is used as a blanket coverage of all federal programs to administer policies involving the allocation of federal grant funding. The strategy has been used for the protection of disadvantaged groups in the US, as well as health and safety issues and environmental protections. The trailblazing act that initiated this federal strategy was Title VI of 1964 Civil Rights Act, which codified the non-discriminatory policies. Programs funded, or quote, programs funded with federal dollars shall not discriminate against any person by race, color, or national origin. Okay, so the next one is the crossover sanctions. This one's a doozy. Crossover sanctions requirements generate the horizontal federal approach in implementing conditions on grant funding. Crossover sanctions are the disciplinary strategy the federal government takes when state and local agencies fail to administer their policies. This is the government pulling out of their big guns or flexing its muscles by targeting the pockets of state agencies. Infringement on federal mandates can jeopardize the state agency's federal funding for any associated program. This, of course, can be detrimental to states' economic development. This aggressive approach is common, but can be seen as extremely effective. This aggressive approach is uncommon, but can be seen as an extremely effective way to enforce potentially controversial mandates, receiving pushback from state and local agencies. And a perfect example is the Highway Beautification Act of 1965. Congress' main intention was to regulate billboard advertisements off interstate highways. Initially in 1958, Congress offered financial bonuses for all the states that agreed to regulate billboard advertising. When they did that, only 18 states complied and authorized billboard regulations into law. So Congress switched their approach and altered into sanctions by denying 10% of state highway construction funds to those who didn't abide by that federal mandate. As you can assume, the rest of the states fell in line with the federal mandate. Targeting the pockets of state and local agencies is a very aggressive way, yet effective for the federal government. It's kind of the financial stick and carrot approach. And lastly, partial preemption. These are one of the final regulation techniques the government utilizes. Preemption facilitates the transition of power from a superior level of government to a lower level government agency or organization. In the case of partial preemption, federal laws determine the basic regulations or thresholds, while state and local agencies are deemed the administrative responsibilities to meet national standards. I'm sorry, give me 1 sec. I don't want my computer to die. Okay, apologies. Yes, in the case of partial preemption, federal laws determines the basic regulations or threshold, while state and local agencies are deemed the administrative responsibilities to meet national standards. An example of this is the Water Quality Act of 1965. This is an appropriate example because This enabled states to set their own standards for water within their jurisdictional boundary, so long as they met the federal regulatory threshold that the federal agency set. This created the if-then approach. So if states' regulations were up to par with government standards, then a federal agency would enforce, if the state regulations were not up to par with the government standards, then the federal agency would enforce their own federal standards. And if the state did not adopt those federal standards, then the government has the right to assume that jurisdiction. This federal technique was often criticized. Critiques lamented how preemption challenges federalism. Partial preemption relies on the unitary vision of the federal government rather than the non-centralized system. So those are 4 major strategies. These strategies also can be combined as well. And a perfect example, we have the 1970s Clean Air Act, where preemption or partial preemption and crossover sanctions were combined in order to implement the federal mandate. The law relies upon technique and partial preemption. States must prepare state implementation plans for the 1970 Clean Air Act, and those state implementation plans are approved by the federal agency, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. If they fail to do that, then those agencies, EPA and the Department of Transportation, have the right to withhold any grant awards in any air quality controlled regions. So that's a perfect example of 2 of these federal strategies combined in order to have state and local agencies comply. So digressing on these 4 tactics, these federal tactics that are commonly used, it's very interesting, especially working in a local sector, trying to figure out what actually what affects my day-to-day life and what I guess take for granted of certain standards and practices. That's not something that is mandated from any of the state or local, but the federal agency. A lot of the examples that the article provides seem like they're pretty good examples as to why the federal government would take those direct orders or certain sanctions, crossover sanctions. But there is a lot of critique as to the push for federalism and pure federalism as opposed to not having a decentralized government. So the arguments are very passionate, and I see both sides, but a lot of the examples that I see seem like, I guess, the government in that sense was made the right decision. Other examples seem like it could have been an overreach. So it seems like this is a constant discussion that we have, and pretty much is the theme of this class. Okay, so now I will be getting everyone else involved just to see if you're paying attention. Question 1, what are the 2 least common tactics used for federal regulation? A, eminent domain and crossover sanctions. B, cross-cutting requirements and impeachment. C, direct order and crossover sanctions. Or D, none of the above. You could please answer in chat. Awesome. You guys are great. 100%. Yes, it is C. Those are probably the most or the strongest, but not so common tactics used. Question 2, what federal strategy was used to enact Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964? All right, so this one's a little bit more confusing. It's actually B. One of the most important of these requirements for the cross-cutting requirements is a non-discrimination provision included in Title VI, which stipulates no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in being be denied the benefits of or be subjected to discrimination under any program receiving federal financial assistance. So that's that cross-cutting requirement that applies across the board for all federal programs that are receiving some type of, or is allocating some type of federal funding. So that was question 2. You guys are 1 for 1. Third question. And this one is a more open-ended question. I will answer it and then I will bring it to the class if anyone else has any personal experience. But question 3, has your organization experienced federal mandates? What were / are they? How did your organization adapt? Which strategies did the government use to encourage compliance? So in my situation, I am a planner. I work for a oops, don't want to do that. I'm a planner and I work for a county jurisdiction. And after reading these different strategies and the examples they used to provide, it clicked in my head that one of the things, let's see, of course, CEQA is a common thing that planners use, and that kind of trickles down from EPA. But one of the things that was very, very, I guess, common in reviewing permits was the Federal Communications Commission. This was on November 18th. Back in, I believe it's 2014, they adopted an order that complied various policies establishing presumptive deadlines for communication tower applications and preempting local zoning for the locations of these cell towers. So today, our zoning division reviews co-location permits as a by right use. The local jurisdiction does not have any teeth to prevent or deny any permits for co-location permits. And we have to review and approve these permits within 90 days. So essentially that mandate streamlines the any applications for that type of permit. Communication towers can be built within any zone district, ministerially or through an entitlement. So that's another situation under the same mandate, to where communication towers, if they have a location where they did their studies and they assume that this location is the best location for the cell tower, we really don't have a say in if they can or cannot build it. We just have to go through the process of it. But our ordinance has been updated to where cell towers essentially can be anywhere, whether it's a by right use, depending on the zoning, or with a conditional use permit. During 2014, various interest groups, of course, try to push back on this. The National League of Cities, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, didn't express their concern about local agencies losing their power to regulate the location of communication towers. But as you can see, that did not work. So that is my personal experience of partial preemption. Yeah, so going back to the class, if anyone else has any personal experience or any governmental strategies that were used and felt in your guys' organization. Feel free to express.
Well, I don't think that I'm in local government, so we don't directly have federal impacts, but it's to state. But something that comes to my mind is that the states are required to, by the FAA, to convert all the driver's license into a biometric readable smart ID. So that mandate was to go into effect like 2 years ago. Now they found that it's difficult to make that deadline, so it has been extended. So I thought that would be some kind of a mandate that the federal government is pushing on states to adopt, have these
Thank you, Faisal. Okay, so if no one else has any other experiences that they would like to share, then that concludes my presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kumar. Yeah, it is a really useful article because as you correctly point out, it lays out these 4 different categories of mandates. And as you also point out, direct order mandates we don't see used as often federal handed down to the state because of constitutional limitations. You know, for the most part, a direct order mandate's only used when Congress has a direct constitutional authority to require a state to take a certain type of action. And for the most part, Congress has exhausted pretty much all those things that they have direct constitutional authority over. Now, obviously, the Supreme Court can intercede, and the Supreme Court, through a series of court cases and decisions, can always expand the interpretation of congressional authority in the Constitution. But that's a very difficult road to hoe. That's a very difficult thing to accomplish. Now, we do see direct order mandates from the state handed down to local governments because, again, as we know, as a result of this class, local governments are creatures of the state. And so the state doesn't have to worry about as much about constitutional limitations as the federal government may need to be concerned with. An important thing about these 4 different categories of mandates is that Congress can use them, different mandates for different types of purposes. And so those cross-cutting mandates, we oftentimes, as Kamara pointed out, we see that a lot in terms of anti-discrimination, that you may not discriminate in the areas of education or employment or housing and so on, voting for purposes of race. So that's cross-cutting usually you see in anti-discrimination. The crossover mandates that Kamara talked about are the ones that are seen as oftentimes the most insidious by state and local governments, because what the federal government will do is it will punish a state for non-compliance in one area by taking money away from them in another related area. As Kamara had on the slide, the Highway Beautification Act back in the 1950s is a great example of that, and then reauthorized in the 1960s. One example we had talked about, I think, earlier in an earlier session, the Clinton administration blood alcohol content levels, and that if a state did not adopt the 0.08 blood alcohol content level, then that state would end up losing federal highway money. States didn't adopt the 55-mile-per-hour speed limit back in the 1970s. They would then lose federal highway transportation money. Partial preemption, those are the types of mandates that we see most prominently in environmental protection. And we see those in terms of establishing a federal minimum standard and saying states must at least adhere to that federal minimum standard. They can go above that federal minimum standard if they want and have stricter state laws, but at the very least, they have to at least have standards as strict as the federal minimum standard in terms of environmental protection. Here in California, we typically go beyond the federal minimum standard, but we are allowed to do that because of this idea of partial preemption. So I think it's very instructive to give us those 4 categories, and you can see how Congress, based upon how much flexibility it has in terms of constitutional power, based upon what it's trying to achieve, it will select different types of mandates to use. The big question, obviously, that goes along with which type of mandate's being used is how much money is being attached to that mandate. And as Kamara also talked about, and we had mentioned before in this class, the ACAR is no longer around. You mentioned was defunded in 1996. I had the opportunity to work on that last project, that last draft report that Kamara had mentioned that was never fully adopted by the commissioners, but it was the report that ended up leading to the demise of the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, which is very unfortunate. But it's ever since the ACIR has gone out of existence, we really don't have a corollary agency around to kind of pick up the slack of what the ACIR used to do. And it was a very helpful agency in terms of doing all kinds of research on questions of federalism and relationships between federal, state, and local governments. Okay, thank you very much, Kamar. I appreciate that. Any other questions or observations on that Techniques of Intergovernmental Relations article? Again, establishing those 4 different types of mandates, I think, is the most important part of the article for us tonight. Okay.
Professor, just I read that the unfunded mandates Reforms Act was what caused a report that came out was the main reason that that nailed the coffin. So why didn't the Democrats or the Republicans give a fight to protect it?
Well, I think the primary reason why they got rid of it is that that draft report was very negative for a lot of congressional overreach. And I know the part that I worked on looked at the Americans with Disabilities Act and the impacts of the ADA regulations on local school districts. And that was kind of my little piece of the pie. And then my co-author, Mike Pagano, worked on another part of the ADA. But I know just from our conclusions is that one of the major problems was a lack of communication, in that Congress didn't do a good job of communicating to local school districts the flexibility that they actually had in terms of incorporating these new regulations into their capital improvement plans. A lot of local school districts thought they had to do these things immediately. They didn't have the money to do these things immediately. And so they would have to shift money around. They'd have to stop doing these programs, all these extracurriculars would have to go away because they would have to lower the height of a water fountain, or they would have to make some changes to their entryway. They would have to make those changes, but the ADA was very clear on you can incorporate those into your capital improvement plan. So they don't have to be done today, but they do have to be part of your 5-year capital improvement plan. A lot of local school districts didn't understand that because Congress never clearly communicated to those districts. And so those districts were pushing back very hard on these ADA requirements because they were saying we don't have the resources to do it. In a lot of the other legislation that other co-authors looked at, they found that these are pieces of legislation, these are things that should be left to state governments. And it shouldn't be something that Congress is doing. It was a great overreach on the part of Congress in a lot of these other areas of legislation. And so the draft report was put together, and since you have 6 members of Congress who serve among those, I think it was 20-some commissioners on the ACIR, they had the draft report that they then disseminated to their colleagues in Congress. Congress didn't like that this draft report said that Congress was overreaching from a federalism perspective, and so they defunded the ACIR even before the commissioners approved that draft report. That's why it's considered a draft report. It was never truly approved by the commissioners because the ACIR was defunded before they even had a chance to discuss and approve the report. But that's pretty much why. It's because both Democrats and Republicans didn't like the conclusion that the Congress had overreached in terms of their powers in American federalism. So it's unfortunate. I just had a very small piece of its demise. So it's not all my fault, just a really small piece of it. But it's unfortunate that the ACIR is gone because, again, it's been now, if I do my math correctly, what's it been, 26 years now, and we still don't have another organization like the ACIR to do this type of research. So what has happened is it's decentralized the research to individual scholars. So you have individual federalism scholars at universities spread all over the country that are doing this research, but there's not really an overarching organization to pull all this research together and make sense of this research. And it's a shame, but the longer we go without a new ACIR, probably the less likely it is that anyone will feel that there's an imperative to have a new ACIR. So after 26 years, I just don't see a new ACIR coming about in the near future. Okay,
Thank you, Professor.
Sure, it's a great question. But Congress does this sometimes. That's one way that you can get rid of an agency without killing it outright is you defund it, you zero it out, you take away its funding. And once John Kincaid lost the funding, he couldn't pay his leases, he couldn't pay for any of these contracts, and so he shuttered the ACIR and he went off to, I believe he went to Lafayette College in Pennsylvania and taught there for the remainder of his career. So it's unfortunate, but it does happen. Okay, let's move on to, I guess, our 10 Commandments article. So, Coral, that one is yours.
Thank you. Okay. So can everybody see that okay and hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so I am presenting on 10th Commandments, Federal Prescriptions and City Problems by Pietro Nivola. This comes from, this is a book. So this is just one article from his book. And this was published in 2002. And so I'm gonna ask some questions throughout, and I'd appreciate if you all could utilize the chat and unmute yourself. They're not difficult questions or like test questions, but just to kind of get the conversation going. This article I feel is a little bit different from many of the ones that we've gone through. It almost feels more like just a discussion or an argument that he's trying to make. So let's get going. Okay, so he starts with introducing the State of the Cities US report that's issued each year, but this is like taking place at the end of 1999, headed into 2000. And this report says that, through the economic policies of Clinton and Gore and, all of our successes, most cities are showing clear signs of revitalization and renewal. And he talks about how this is a little bit misleading because although most cities are showing clear signs of revitalization and renewals, there are challenges that other cities are facing that are substantial. So what kinds of challenges were these cities facing? This is a topic that we've talked about a whole lot throughout different courses that we've taken in this program, but he focuses on suburban sprawl. And these sprawling suburban subdivisions that were accounting for more than 3/4 of all new metropolitan growth across the country. But not just generally suburban sprawl throughout the US, but he really honed in on these larger central cities that were being impacted more significantly than anyone else. So he kind of dives into why that is and how federal prescriptions and mandates play a huge role. And it's so interesting now, reading this was published, I said, like in 2002. So 20 years later and seeing the impacts and seeing how suburban sprawl didn't really let up. Yeah, so my first question for you is just really simple, and you can put this in the chat. Where do you currently live right now? Do you live in a city or do you live in a suburb? And let me see if I can pull up the chat this way. And then if a couple of you wanted to unmute yourself, maybe somebody who lives in a city can share first and explain why. And then whoever lives in the suburbs, explain why. If you chose to live there, I guess. Yeah, so most right now are in the suburbs. Yeah, so it's more affordable than the city. Yeah, I live in a city. And it's interesting having this discussion because I grew up in a very rural part of Fresno County, surrounded by farmland and everything. So I never ever wanted to live in a suburb. And and now I have a really short commute. But I also don't have a family and don't plan to start a family anytime soon. Not looking to buy a house right now. Yeah, living in a city now, or not just now, but living in a city can be more expensive. Yeah, so that sounds right. Sounds right on par with this article. So let's move forward. So as I mentioned, which cities were prone to more challenges? These large central cities listed here. You saw it more in the Northeast and the Midwest, these Frost Belt cities. And why were people moving out of these cities? I think a lot of the points that we make even still today, right? Maybe it's more affordable, there are larger properties, lots of different reasons, but it's not necessarily because there wasn't space inside central cities. Navala makes the argument that there were hundreds of acres inside these central cities, but these like housing development permits were 4 times larger across the nation in surrounding cities. So developing that sprawl that we see. Okay. So in the suburbs, you also saw higher employment growth. And during this time, the private sector employment in central cities had declined from 1993 through 1996 in comparison to the surrounding region. There was also this preference for suburban life. People who lived in the suburbs were really happy to be, leaving the central cities. And I think that's for a culmination of reasons that I'm going to get into. While within the central cities, we saw poverty, substantial rates of poverty in the central cities that Navala highlights. The vast majority of residents within those cities made up the majority of welfare recipients in that state. We also saw or see today barriers to racial or class assimilation in the suburbs. I think it was much more visible at that time, but even still, we see that today. And it wasn't, as accessible for low income communities of color to move out of central cities in the way that white people had the opportunity to do that and had the income to do that. Within central cities, we saw stiff city tax rates and still see that. And his main point is we saw or still see federal projects and mandates that made the functions of the city entirely more difficult to make progress. And he also talks about, like I said, this was in 2002, he says that in 9/11, the 9/11 attacks, that certainly didn't help anything. So the economic toll that it took on the country, and particularly, New York, DC, Miami, and even San Francisco here in California were substantial. And he also highlights just briefly that this definitely didn't help anything. Like this terrorist attack didn't help with wanting people to move into a central city, which I thought was interesting because it's not really something that I had considered prior. And this is, he goes on to break down that cities in the US are, or governments in the US are, or governments here in this country are substantially, they function differently than across the globe, of course, as we know. So 2/3 of, or, oh, I wrote this wrong, but 2/3 of our, oh no, I did write this right, sorry. 2/3 of cities in the US, their revenues come from local sources, so taxpayer dollars or tax revenue. And this is unlike the majority of Europe. But he argues, yes, it does make sense for taxpayers to pay for their municipal services, but they're not just paying for those municipal services. And during this time, we saw federal projects grow and federal mandates grow substantially while federal aid was shrinking. Like it wasn't, they weren't setting cities up for success to be able to meet these federal mandates and fulfill the federal prescriptions with the amount of aid that was being provided to these cities. And this wasn't necessarily super harmful for the wealthier jurisdictions that were surrounding the central cities, but in the Northeast and the Midwest, they couldn't keep up. And I'll go into that a little bit more. So just reiterating, the central cities with large concentrations of low-income households that had shaky taxable wealth were most impacted by the federal implications. And central cities' financial needs became harder at the end of the 1990s. And so he gives this example of municipal wastewater treatment costs. And so the local expenditures to build and run these treatment plants in 1978 cost around 7.5 billion, and it grew to more than 23 billion in 1998. So it wasn't just, gradual building over time. It was significant and had detrimental impacts on these cities. And right, as these projects grow, federal funding allocated to the cities dwindled as well. And he provides these graphs, which help display federal aid that was allocated to large cities. So the first graph here on the left, we'll see in 1980, it's almost $7 billion that were provided to large cities from the federal government. And then by 1998, it's significantly less. And it was the lowest in 89 and 92. And then on the right, we see the general revenue for these cities is it's predominantly made up of the city's own revenue in comparison to intergovernmental aid. And we see across, 1980 through 1998, significant decreases in intergovernmental aid. And these are across the Frost Belt cities. And then local versus federal wastewater expenditures here on the left, same thing. So you see federal expenditures are significantly lower in 1998 compared to what they were in 78, and you see local capital and operations and maintenance just grow year by year. And in Detroit specifically, he talks a lot about Detroit because they were one of the cities who, while these multi-million-dollar expenses were being piled on, they had to take out loans in order to fulfill these obligations. So you see their own revenue, their federal aid, state and local aid through 1980, 1998, the same trend. And so that brings me to my next question is, are the rates of federal aid that were just displayed surprising, and why or why not? Because, well, to me, I feel, well, because I don't work in local government, and really the MPA program, this gives me a lot of exposure to things or to topics that I generally just weren't aware of before, because my background's just a little bit different. And so this is not really something that I've ever paid attention to. So it is surprising to see it all graphed out like, wow, these are substantial, just disproportionate allocations where you think, wow, the more would be allocated to cities. Yeah, so it was surprising to me. Anybody else find it surprising? Or I'm sure a lot of you that have worked in government for a long time, it's not surprising. Just anything you'd like to add?
Hey, this is Crystal. So I was actually a part of a federal legislative advocacy committee for the city of Torrance, where basically it's us seeking funding from the federal government. We go and we're lobbying as a municipality to try to get access to these funds. And our consultant mentioned that Congress right now is hung up over, I think he mentioned something like $25 billion in spending, and even though it's a $1.3 trillion budget, they feel that they've already given enough money to the country to stimulate, with the stimulus package and everything, and try to pump in some growth for throughout the country. But they don't want to continue spending on government projects. So I thought that was super interesting because they were willing to essentially pay us all to stay home when we were on lockdown. And now that, cities have taken a hit because of the whole COVID pandemic, buildings are deteriorating. And now the federal government is saying, well, we've already spent enough on the country. Sorry, figure it out. So I just thought that was interesting to hear today.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think that ties into the sort of disconnect that the author, that's what his whole argument is based around, this disconnect between what federal prescriptions, what sort of impact they have on local government who, need support, need this aid. Yeah, so it's interesting. Thank you. And I'll move forward. So Nivala goes on to provide different examples of how when this was occurring throughout the 1990s, tax reductions weren't being initiated within these cities when they desperately needed them. And city managers were trying to, were kind of grappling with, them not being able to execute what they maybe would have wanted to because their hands were tied by this federal prescription. So routine services were being delayed, city improvements become complicated or delayed. And I think we can think of several different examples of that still being demonstrated to maybe communities we live in or surrounding areas as well. So my next question, similar to what Kamara asked, can you give an example of when a federal prescription prohibited or delayed execution of necessary services in your work?
Well, I'd like to share some of my experience working with federal funds. So the federal funding requirements now it has changed now, but I'm saying like 5 years ago or maybe 6 years ago that we did not have to do prevailing wage on any of our projects. So when we go out to bid, we have our specification documents that's not catered into federal funds. So when sometimes federal funds are granted, we have to use the money, we have to get things like these minority owned businesses and even like things like prevailing wage, what does that does is that exponentially increases our cost on the project. So it just makes it harder for us in the sense like, so then when we, after we do a federal funding project, the contractors like get automatically, they kind of accustomed to charge higher rates. And then when we go back to with projects, then they try to come up with federal, like on the prevailing wage rate. So basically we kind of get squeezed in between afterwards.
Mhm. Thank you. Anyone else?
What about when the government shut us all down? I couldn't even go to work
Yeah.
because we couldn't do anything in person. And because my previous position at the time was so public oriented, there was nothing we could do in terms of serving those that still wanted to do business with the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great example. I think of one, as I mentioned, I don't work in local government, but I do work for a community college who provides in-prison education to a nearby state prison. And I don't know if any of you heard yesterday, there were 5 prison closures in California that were just announced, and that impacts our program. So it's one of our facilities. So there are 2 that we serve, but it's set to be completely closed at the end of in December of 23. And so it cuts our program in half. I mean, there are hundreds of jobs where like CDCR staff, education staff, nurses, correctional officers, hundreds that are going to be either, displaced or laid off, transferred. And then our students are going to be sent to different facilities across the state. And so it was devastating news, not to say that I'm not supportive of prison closures, but I think our team at the community college, we weren't feeling like we were even really being thought of when those decisions were being made, which makes sense. I mean, 10 years ago, prison education wasn't even an option, especially in person, but it's devastating and we just have to adjust. We don't get a say and it's abrupt. So that's something that's sort of applicable to this theme, the state prescription, the state mandate that's closing these prisons, that's devastating our program. Yeah, so that's just my example. So I'll move on. Navala concludes this initial argument by drawing themes that he described he shifts away from city, well, not entirely, he doesn't shift away from city budgets, but he kind of transitions to talking about urban public schools and how federal mandates and prescriptions are sort of contributing to suburban sprawl in this facet as well. So public education, right? It's a crucial local service. It's beset by bureaucratic rules and regulations. It has an incredible amount of federal directives. And he hones in on special education specifically because it significantly impacts these central cities more so than surrounding areas. So federal compliance costs require that the city school budget, 1/3 of it is dedicated to special education. But he talks about how special education populations are growing. We see that still. The definition of who constitutes as being like learning disabled or in need of special education is evolving. And he gives the example of Chicago, who Chicago's schools make account for about 50% of all of Illinois' special education population, whereas most other schools, their population is only about 15% of their general population. So when there's a city like Chicago who has this overload, there isn't federal aid to supplement it, essentially, and they're suffering. The ones who are most in need of special education services are suffering based on this specific mandate that's prescribed by the federal government. And so he ties this all back into why people are fleeing and avoiding central cities, and says like, how can they possibly compete with wealthier suburban counterparts? And this made me think of, even as a kid, like I had a friend who, lived sort of on the outskirts of town, and her parent was trying to get her into a different school district that maybe was more affluent than the school district that we were designated in. We see that still today. So to wrap it all up, his main points, or his main questions, his main argument is there a suitable balance between local and federal domains, and how much is too much? So, entitling his book 10th Commandments, making that parallel between the 10 Commandments and, how strict and how you must follow them, I thought was really interesting. So I really appreciated this article, especially, like I said, reading it 20 years after it's published, and now we see the impacts of suburban sprawl. And I think his honing in on federal projects specifically and intergovernmental relations was interesting, because I think there are also so many other routes you can take when talking about causes of suburban sprawl. Yeah, so that's it for me. That concludes my presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Coral. Well done. And yeah, I do like some of these articles have really great titles. 10th Commandments, I think, is a very good title for the article. It's pretty appropriate. And the section on education, special education funding, obviously hits me directly. The past 6 years I've been on a local school board, and there's something we refer to as a special education bleed. And the special education bleed is the amount of money that we would have to take from our general fund to supplement for these federal special education mandates that were not being paid for by the federal government. And it was always kind of shocking to see just how little reimbursement we got from the federal government for carrying out these special education mandates. And granted, these are important mandates to carry out. Education for students with disabilities and special education students with special education needs obviously is much more expensive, and it needs to be funded. The problem is that the federal government for our district would reimburse anywhere from about 15 to 30% to pay for those federal mandates in special education. That then leaves 70 to 85% of the money that's needed to pay for these programs would have to come from local sources, would have to come from local school district sources. When you look at a local school district budget, the only area you can really get that money from is going to be your Fund 01, your general fund, because that's the only fund that has these unrestricted monies. And there are opportunity costs then, that if you're going to take this money out of your general fund and use it to pay for these mandated special education programs, which you have to do, then the opportunity cost is you have that money to spend on other programs. And so you'd have to take from other programs in order to pay for what the federal government should be paying for. That's kind of that thing they refer to as that shift and shaft. And so the federal government shifts the accountability, shifts the responsibility for these programs through mandates to state and local governments. And then at the same time, they also give them the shaft by not providing them the resources in order to carry out these regulations and carry out these mandates. More generally, in terms of city governments, what we have seen is whenever these federal mandates come down to city governments, and city governments do not have the requisite resources to pay for these mandates, Where their money comes from is oftentimes from deferred maintenance. So they will continue deferring maintenance in order to free up money to pay for some of these federal mandates. Well, why do they usually hit deferred maintenance? They usually go after deferred maintenance because, at least initially, it's the least visible cut that you can make. So if you have to make a choice between cutting services being provided to your citizens or cutting back in your deferred maintenance budget, you're probably going to cut your deferred maintenance budget because that has less political pain than cutting actual services that people are relying upon every single day. That makes some logical, rational sense for a few years. But obviously, if you continue to defer maintenance, then you're going to end up with all the culmination of those deferred years of maintenance resulting into a major infrastructure crisis. And that's what a lot of our major cities have run into. We've seen these storm sewer systems that are 70, 80, 90 years old. And we've been deferring the maintenance on them to free up money to pay for these federal mandates for other programs in other areas. And eventually these systems collapse. And then they cost a lot more to repair once they've collapsed than if we would have done the deferred maintenance in the years leading up to that collapse, and hopefully prohibited that or stop that collapse from happening. So that's the whole theme of the articles that Coral talked about, is this whole idea of this, the accountability, the responsibility gets shifted down to state and local governments, but the shaft is the money does not accompany it. And that's kind of the old adage in federalism, is everything rolls downhill in federalism except for funding. The money doesn't come downhill, but all the accountability and all the responsibility flows down, but without the money attached to be able to do it. It's very good. Thank you, Coral. Well done. And it's our 10th Commandments article. And now we'll move to Christina, who will talk to us about another look at bargaining.
Okay, try and do this. Share. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know why, but I can't see the chat, so I'm doing something wrong, but I'll just proceed. Tonight, I'm going to be presenting the article by Robert Agronoff and Michael McGuire, another look at bargaining and negotiating in intergovernmental management. Okay, and now it's not. It doesn't want to work for me for some reason now. Let me try that. Here we go. So Robert Agronoff and Michael McGuire detail the historical basis for our current system of intergovernmental bargaining and the need, and sort of outline the need for our current system to exist. They argue that administrative bargaining and not political is our primary bargaining system, and that this type of old-fashioned bargaining is both highly transactional and managerial. The authors argue that the United States is designed perfectly for this type of intergovernmental relationship, and that these relationships extend far beyond grant and aid programs. They then will conclude the article by outlining the many ways in which these dynamics have yet to be researched, and argue that there's a large body of previously unexamined research that proves that intergovernmental bargaining is the foundation of our modern federalism. Ultimately, this model, which is deemed cooperative federalism, is a more accurate way to describe our current system of government. Oops, sorry. I'm having issues with my share screen here. Here we go. The authors then describe the pillars of bargaining and negotiation, the first pillar being the importance of place or jurisdiction-based management. Whether you're a federal representative, a state, or a local municipality may dictate the legal rights, your legal rights decreed by the Constitution. Fortunately for local representatives, there is a strong American tradition of local deference. Some contemporary academics have argued that this power of local jurisdiction is waning due to the theory of administrative conjunction, which argues that jurisdictional lines are increasingly porous and that their definitions are less critical than in the past. For example, in a city like Los Angeles, citizens have had to move further, as has already been discussed tonight, citizens have had to move further away from the city center due to housing and affordability issues. As such, an Angelino may work in the city, reside in the county, and conduct their business in nearby suburbs. We are no longer as limited by one single jurisdiction or place as maybe in years past, especially in a place as sprawling and car dependent as Los Angeles. So just like a fun question to anybody, like, I know, well, how many local jurisdictions and places do you think your personal interests spread out to? I'll call it like an interest sprawl. So very few of us sort of reside, work, and do business in one local jurisdiction. So how many, does anyone want to talk about some of their interest sprawl and how many places that might spread out over? I prepared for that, so I'll tell you mine. So personally, I live in the county in the San Fernando Valley, which is also part of the city, but I live right next door to San Fernando City, which is its own city out of Los Angeles City, but part of Los Angeles County. And so we are in San Fernando a lot. My husband works in Simi Valley, which is Ventura County, for the school district, which is its own elected board and system of government. And then just like last weekend, we were in Santa Monica, which everyone knows is part of the county, but is not the city. So just in that little, that's not all of our interests, right? Like my parents live in Glendale, which is the county, not the city. Our interests are represented by all of those different factions of elected officials, governing boards, policies, laws, and local policies. But that's just mine. The second pillar that they go into of bargaining and negotiation is limited national bureaucracy. The governing structure of the United States was created in response to the perceived tyrannical British rule and designed to design out the potential for state abuse. This fundamental sort of contempt for the state slowly diminished with the advent of the welfare state, quote unquote, in the 19th century, when state administrative growth was needed to manage all of the new federal programs. While our long tradition of limited national bureaucracy has slowly changed, our fundamental reverence for local authority has not totally been usurped. Congressional action may stem from above, but does favor a carrot approach, as discussed earlier, that urges local action with federal resources rather than administering those programs directly at the federal level. This is referred to as the state local highway model and ensures that local control of programs is prioritized, but intergovernmental cooperation is still essential. So the question that the article brought up is, can anyone think of an example of a service that is not locally centralized, but instead federally administered? I wouldn't have thought of one except that the article told me. And then I was like, oh yeah. And
what about the COVID funds? Isn't that a federal
yes
money?
Well, this is a federal service. So like the Postal Service. So that is federally administered from the federal level and not at the local level. So I expanded a little bit, tiny bit on the article, as using it as a case study. So the post office is one of the notable exceptions of an exception to the localized service model. And if you're a NPR wonk or whatever, like me, they're sort of, especially during the last presidential election, they were constantly under fire from the left and the right. They're not sustainable. They're at a loss. We can't keep underwriting the costs of these services. And then Trump appointed through the Board of Governors, Louis DeJoy, who had no experience in doing this. He was a Republican political operative. And that was mired in controversy, that in accusations of him trying to fix the mail-in ballots and close mailing centers and all that sort of stuff. But it's still going on because Biden can't just fire him if he wanted to. There's a Board of Governors who are appointed by the president, but he's still around. But still like they're constantly sort of mired in this controversy and accusations of inefficiencies and unsustainability. So it's sort of a case study, and maybe we should not administer these services at the federal level, especially when you introduce politics and political appointees into these vital positions. The third pillar is multi-level simultaneous action, which basically just refers to the need for more than one system of government to operate at any given time. So while the United States systems are multi-layered with all of these different levels, they aren't completely interdependent. There's always a mutual or cooperative function between any system of government for any given program. The last pillar is reciprocal administrative action. The absence of a large federal bureaucratic presence locally means that administrators take on a large role in implementation and operations of programs, or as the authors call it, administrative discretion. To use their quote, they said, to a considerable degree, local success and advancing the interest of local government depends on local officials taking advantage of what the federal government has to offer and is willing to advance and accept. The opportunity is universal, but not every local administration partakes. Grant programs are the clearest example of this cooperative relationship, since local jurisdictions must bargain with the granting agencies, whether it be at the state or the federal level, for both large and small details. And grant programs are inherently collaborative in that the granting institution needs the recipient to fulfill a set of outcomes and policies for them, and the recipient needs the granting institution for the resources, obviously. So it is an inherently cooperative two-way relationship. Intergovernmental bargaining does go beyond grant and aid, though. An example of this two-way collaborative work is, I think most of us remember the controversy over No Child Left Behind in the during George W. Bush. No Child Left Behind changed education funding from a more egalitarian, broad-based funding approach to one that was performance-based. To the states, this felt like a mandate for one model of performance testing in order to secure vital funding, which then also meant less control by the states over their own education dollars. At the time this article was written, the states were in the midst of negotiating the funding terms with the Department of Education, hoping to carve out more control or maximum flexibility with those dollars. In this case, the president's administration wanted to use the funding to force states to assume a policy agenda. As an update, after the article was, published, President Obama put an end to No Child Left Behind in 2015 with the Every Student Succeeds Act, which notably tried to give more of that flexibility and power back, more of that back into the states' hands. The federal level still provides a broad framework for the accountability, but the states can set the goals for schools and the evaluation measures. It did not eliminate the need for testing, but it does now allow the states to use more than test scores to evaluate schools. So another question for everyone is if you can think, like the No Child Left Behind Act, if you can think of any other example of this type of intergovernmental bargaining over a large federal policy or program. And apologies if you're typing anything in the chat, I can't see it. Oh, wait, there it is. Well, I have one ready to go. And it's famous Obamacare, or the ACA Medicaid expansion. The ACA, well, part of the ACA expanded Medicaid coverage to nearly all adults with incomes up to 138% of the federal poverty level, and provided states with an enhanced federal matching rate for the expanded coverage populations. However, even as of November 2022, so just now, not all states had opted in for this increased match in exchange for the coverage expansion. So I wanted everyone to take a guess. I mean, I had to look it up because I had no idea. How many states do you think ultimately opted out of the Medicaid expansion dollars? Does anyone have a guess? And I can see the chat now.
My guess is about 23 states.
Good guess. Any other guesses? Oh, and 23. I was surprised. I hadn't revisited that since the time of those, because there's so many other controversies since then to pay attention to. So the answer, when I looked it up, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation, was 11 states have still not opted in as of November. Let's see. So South Dakota, which is that light blue one, has adopted it, but not yet implemented it. So, but I believe they're going to be implementing it this year. They held out the longest, apparently. They didn't opt in until the COVID relief bill of 2021 with Biden, because in the COVID relief bill of 2021, he included additional incentives for the ACA Medicaid expansion holdouts, trying to get, at that point, the 12 states to hurry up and just buy in already, especially during COVID, getting our uninsured populations covered. It was a big deal. So in a nutshell, that bill further increased the incentives and paid for almost the entire cost of the expansion population. In addition to the increased reimbursement rates, I think it was they were going to cover 90%. Dr. Jamila, I think her name is Michener, who wrote a book about Medicaid's role in modern federalism, suggests that any state that had still not opted in for the expansion program after these additional financial incentives in 2021, when she was basically arguing it was essentially paid for. There was she couldn't think of a reason at that point to not opt in, except to her contention, arguably, that it was a form of partisanship in reaction to it being President Obama's sort of signature legislation. And that also it was maybe philosophically a fundamental disagreement over government's role and who it's there to serve and its role in it. Should we be doing this? Is this government's job? So it's a larger philosophical discussion in addition to perhaps just good old-fashioned partisanship. So yes, as of November, these orange states had still not yet opted in. So I actually had a lot of trouble reading this article. It's very academic and it's prose. So it took me a while to kind of piece it together and okay, now I see what it's saying. But the way I see it is, despite our government's many levels and jurisdictions and places and layers, it's not a series of silos working independently, but rather all of the systems are independent, necessitating cooperation and negotiation between all of the moving pieces. In other words, cooperative federalism has replaced the concept of dual federalism. And with so many moving pieces, collaboration is essential, or all of our systems and processes and services would come to a grinding halt. So I picture a well-oiled machine, which when inspected is actually a series of individual parts, each with their own function. But if not for the gears and linkages meant to connect all the mechanisms into one functional machine, then the machine is rendered useless. So in conclusion, Agronoff and McGuire argue that while there is ample evidence of this multi-level intergovernmental cooperation, empirical research supporting the importance of intergovernmental bargaining is lacking, and make an excellent case for our continued study of these dynamics, their utility, and their place in a functioning democracy. Continued study of these relationships could yield increased public awareness in addition to a healthier administrative process and a healthier functioning democracy. Thank you.
Very well done. Thank you, Christine. And it is a somewhat difficult article, kind of a dense article to get through, but I think you did a really nice job and pulled out all the important elements from the article. Looking at the ACA, the expansion of Medicaid is a great example. Another example from the ACA was the establishment of these state exchanges. And we also saw several states that were really dragging their feet in terms of establishing an exchange in their state. So much so that the federal government gave a deadline that states had to establish an exchange by this date. And some states said, no, we're not going to do it. We're going to, take our marbles and go home. We're not going to play ball. The problem for those states is that those states that didn't participate, the federal government set up exchanges for them. And so they lost all their flexibility and all their ability to negotiate and bargain over what those exchanges would look like because they missed the deadline. And so the federal government just simply did it for them. And so it kind of backfired. And I think you're right. And the author you refer to is correct that there is a lot of partisanship that's involved in the question of expand Medicaid expansion and the creation of the state exchanges under ACA. It is very political in nature, and I think that's you can kind of see patterns in that map you showed us that kind of support that conclusion, at least as a partial explanation. I think the article is really important in showing us how different we are and how different our traditions are, political traditions, as compared to a nation that is more used to a unitary type of government. So, these discussions that are going on in this article and the discussions going on in this class overall are discussions you would not have in a nation like Saudi Arabia, where you have a much more unitary government and you don't have all these different governments working simultaneously, oftentimes working on implementing the same programs and the same policies across multiple levels of government. We have one national government, but we have 50 state governments. We have tens of thousands of local governments that are all oftentimes working together in these simultaneous types of administrative actions. And so understanding the pillars of why bargaining is an important element of American federalism is one of the major things that is a good takeaway from this article. And so as you pointed out, Christina, some of the pillars that the authors talk about, the one is the importance of jurisdiction, the importance of place. A lot of our policies are predicated on place. They're predicated upon jurisdiction. You think about our taxation policies. We tend to tax under what's called a situs basis of taxation, SITUS, a situs basis of taxation. And the situs basis of taxation means that we apply tax incident where the transaction is occurring. And so where it occurs, that's where the tax gets placed. Well, if you're very reliant upon a property tax, real property is pretty much fixed, but personal property is not fixed. Corporate property, like inventory, is oftentimes not fixed, is in that it can cross state lines, cross county lines. Sometimes if you get more into an on-demand type of production operation, you don't even have that inventory that can be taxed with a property tax. So there's some argument that because of the mobility of people and capital, that this situs basis for taxation, the importance of jurisdiction, the importance of place, is beginning to erode. As people become more mobile, there's less of a need or perceived need for a situs basis for taxation. So then that leads us to the question of, well, how do we change our tax system in order to make it less dependent upon place, less dependent upon jurisdiction? I think the exercise, Christina, that you took us through in terms of thinking about where you live and all the overlapping jurisdictions is a very good one. You can have maybe like in the valley I live in, we have 5 elementary school districts, and they all have their own boundary areas. But oftentimes you have students going from one district to another for a variety of different reasons. And then you have a unified junior high school and high school district, on top of those 5 elementary districts. And then you have, different city governments that, butt up against some of these districts as well. And it gets very complicated when you create these community facilities districts and do a lot of the negotiation that goes on in coming up with these districts and coming up with the financing for the new capital projects that are necessary because of the development going on in all these different jurisdictions. So place is obviously important, but it's maybe not as important as it was of a pillar for bargaining as we may have seen 50 or 60 years ago when people and capital were not nearly as mobile as they are now. Obviously, we've always had kind of a distrust for federal bureaucracy, for the national government. People, typically relied more on state and local government than they did the federal government. So you have this, vitality, if you will, at the state and the local level. It's kind of this middle tier that state governments have, according to Martha Durthick. The multi-level simultaneous action, whereas Christina discussed with us, we've got all these different levels of government, oftentimes doing the same types of things and working on the same policies and programs at the same time, which leads to reciprocal administrative action between these different levels of government. Whenever you have all these governments involved, essentially you cannot understand the roles and responsibilities and actions of all these different governments simply by looking at it from a law, rules, and regulations perspective. But there's a lot of interaction that goes on between all these different governments that is outside of what you may consider the traditional rules, laws, and regulations. And that's where bargaining comes into play. And I thought there were a couple of really interesting examples that the authors used about bargaining. One example they used was Garfield Heights, Ohio. And Garfield Heights, Ohio is a suburb of Cleveland. And in Garfield Heights, what they were doing is they were submitting multiple grant applications. And so the federal government said, you can't keep submitting all these grant applications. There's only one application that can come from each jurisdiction for these programs. And Garfield Heights responded and said, well, if you let us do two and you guarantee we'll get one of them, then we'll limit it to two, and that's all we'll do. So we won't keep giving you dozens of applications. We'll just limit it to two as long as you guarantee that you'll fund one of them. And so the federal government's okay, we'll guarantee that we'll fund one of your proposals as long as you stop inundating us with all these grant proposals. Again, that's not written anywhere in the rules and regulations. That was an informal bargaining negotiation that went on between Garfield Heights, Ohio, and the federal government. One of the most interesting ones, though, I thought, was the example of the bargaining between Woodstock, Illinois, and the US EPA. And so, here, you've read it already, so I don't have to go through it all with you, but the EPA is basically saying, we're going to require you to test water for these types of pollutants. And so Woodstock, Illinois said, okay, well, we have to do this. It's a federal mandate. But then the EPA said, but you're going to have to pay for it. So we're going to require you to do it, this testing, but you're going to have to pay to carry out this testing. And so Woodstock, Illinois said, well, if you're going to make us pay for this testing, we are going to charge you for the amount of water that we use in doing this federally mandated testing. So again, it's just another interesting example of the bargaining negotiation that goes on that is outside of the more formal understanding of intergovernmental relations that we usually talk about in classes like this. The really big takeaway from this article, as Christina pointed out for us, is that the authors are saying this introduces a new and different research agenda for us in studying American federalism. We need to have a renewed focus on bargaining and negotiations between these different governments at the federal, state, and the local level if we truly want to understand the entire portrait of the relationship between these governments. It's not just looking at what type of mandate is it and how much funding is there for that mandate. What's going on outside the lines? What's going on in terms of the bargaining negotiation between these different levels of government? There is a lot of negotiation and bargaining going on, and that's why I made one of our discussion posts, the one due for Sunday, looking directly at negotiation and bargaining. Because I think if we don't find examples of negotiation and bargaining, we're never going to get a full picture of how our levels of government interact with each other. But the catch for state and local governments is, yes, if they engage in negotiation and bargaining, they may be able to get a quote unquote better deal from the federal government. However, as will be pointed out next week in the Paul Posner article, once they start engaging in bargaining and negotiations, they are essentially validating the mandate. They're saying, okay, we're going to bargain with you over the details of implementing the mandate. But once they do that, they're basically accepting this mandate as being a valid mandate. And once they accept the mandate as being a valid mandate, they can no longer go back and argue against it. They can no longer say this is too much of federal intrusion into an area that should belong to state and local governments. Once you start negotiating it over, you have accepted the premise that it's something the federal government can do. And that really backs state and local governments into a corner then in making this, autonomy type of argument that they like to make in terms of the proper roles and responsibilities of federal versus state and local governments. So it's not really a deal with the devil, not like really a Faustian bargain like we saw with the Spraga article, but it's pretty close to that. And that they're accepting this federal oversight, this federal incursion in order to negotiate better terms for what they have to do on a daily basis. We'll see more of that in the Posner article. I think Paul does a really nice job in that article we'll look at next week, talking about kind of the price that you pay for engaging in this negotiation and this bargaining. Okay, well, again, we have a light week this week because the Posner article is being pushed to next week, but let me very quickly pull up our spreadsheet and just refresh our memory about what we have to do next week on the 12th and the 17th. So we still have the Politics of Unfunded Mandates by Paul Posner, and Bernie will lead us off next week on the 12th, I guess it is, with that article. Then we'll turn our attention to some of these challenges, contemporary and future challenges for American federalism. So we've got the O'Toole article, American Public Administration. We have the Homeland Security article. So the American Public Administration is Jacqueline. The Homeland Security article by Don Kettle is Cellos. The Federalism by Waiver by Thompson is Perla's. And then there's a medical marijuana article, which is Daisy's. And then I think probably we'll be able to also get to the Intergovernmental Relations article by Walters, and this Jelani's. I think those are the articles we'll be able to get through hopefully next Monday. And then for next Saturday, that will then leave us with the two State of American Federalism articles, the Tax Cuts and Job Acts article, Voting Reform article, Governors and Control article, Fiscal Federalism and Economic Crisis in the United States article, and then Oyuki will probably be presenting us with an additional article as well. So I'm looking at 6 articles for next Monday, and then 7 articles for Saturday, the 17th. Admittedly, that is some heavy lifting. That's a lot of articles. Typically, we're covering 4 or 5 a night. It's more for Monday and more for Saturday. So, please plan accordingly. I will not have as much to say about each one of those articles, just to make sure we can get through all those articles next Monday and next Saturday. And please, if you can, make sure to do a concise discussion. We'll keep all the discussions within 30 minutes. And that should get us pretty close to being in and out in about 3.5 hours. And but we will absolutely need a Saturday session in order to finish up all of our articles. Okay. So just to recap, you have your negotiation speech board essay that is due on Sunday. And then if you're doing an article critique on any of those articles I mentioned for next Monday, either Politics of Unfunded Mandates, American Public Administration, Homeland Security, Federalism by Waiver, medical marijuana, or intergovernmental relations, any of those articles, you would have to have those critiques then turned in before class on Monday. And then the remainder of the articles, we will finish up then on Saturday, the 17th. Okay. Sound like a plan? Everybody good?
Real quick,
Yes.
Professor, just wanted to clarify, for the purposes of the article critiques, are the ones that are being pushed to the 17th available to be turned in past the 12th when they would normally be assigned? Or is everything for the purposes of the critiques due before the 12th?
That's a great question. As long as we have not discussed the article yet in class, you can still turn it in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very good question, though.
Professor, can you clarify what was the negotiation article critique, or you mentioned about?
Oh, just I mentioned for our next speech board essay, it focuses on negotiations. And so you'll be selecting one negotiation you're familiar with and talking about the negotiation, who was involved, and the outcome of that.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, there any other questions or anything else? I know it's an early night, but kind of the nature of the beast, the flow of the class, we'll certainly make up this time next Monday and next Saturday.
Professor, I have a question. It's not, I don't think it's directly related to this, but the class, but it's could be a hypothetical question. Can I go ahead?
Oh, absolutely.
So now about jurisdictions of county and cities. Sometimes the city and the county don't have a good relationship. Is it possible for a city to move away from a county? For example, let's say that my city, I mean, let's say I'm in Cerritos, and Cerritos belongs to Orange, to like LA County, and they have a dispute with Orange County, LA County. So the next adjacent county is Orange County. Can they just jump in? It can even apply to say Long Beach, because Long Beach is also bordering these two counties. Is that a possibility? How does it happen? If does it happen?
Yeah, my assumption it'd have to be done through referendum. If it's not done through state legislative action, it'd be through referendum, and it would probably be handled very similar to the proposed succession of the San Fernando Valley and Hollywood from the city of Los Angeles that happened several years ago. And I actually did an article about that, talking about catchy titles. It was Succession in the City, and it was San Fernando Valley proposed succession from Los Angeles. And that was a referendum that was held, and that required, in order to be successful, you had to have a majority vote from the citizens of Hollywood, from people who lived in the San Fernando Valley, as well as the city as a whole. And so, at least in terms of San Fernando Valley, an overwhelming majority of people in San Fernando Valley voted to leave the city of Los Angeles and become their own city. It was something like 72 or 73%. But the rest of the city of Los Angeles voted overwhelmingly against it, because if the city lost San Fernando Valley, they would lose a huge chunk of tax capacity, and they didn't want to lose that taxation. And so you didn't have a majority of the city voting for it, and so therefore it failed. But it was an interesting election because you actually had not only on the ballot, should the San Fernando Valley secede from the city of Los Angeles, but also the citizens in the San Fernando Valley got to vote for a mayor. And so Keith Richmond actually won the mayor election, but never was able to take office because the referendum failed. So I'd assume probably that would be one avenue that the city would pursue, but we'll probably need to have a majority vote from the city, as well as from the residents of the county where that city was leaving from and going to, if you're going to do it through referendum. Is it possible for the state legislature to do that? I think it depends upon whether or not it's a charter government. If it's a charter government, I think it'd be much more difficult for the state legislature to just unilaterally say you can, become part of another county. And most larger cities are charter governments, and so I think that would be difficult for the state legislature to do. My guess, and again, not 100%, I think it'd have to be kind of a similar referendum process that what we saw with the San Fernando Valley. I think you're muted, Faisal.
Just a follow-up question on that. Can the city negotiate with the county on tax apportionments? How much taxes can the city take away from the county could take away from the city, and vice versa?
I would think that most of that will probably be controlled by the state. So there might be some wiggle room, but I think that you'd have to have state approval, especially if you're talking about sales tax, local option sales tax revenue. A lot of that's controlled by Burns-Bradley language. And so I think you probably would have to have some state intervention in that type of discussion.
Can you explain a little bit of preemption, how the preemption works on that? That some cities try to take the money before the county takes over. Is that how is it work? They describe it as preemption.
Yeah, I think preemption, the word preemption means something different when you're talking about federal to state as compared to where you're talking about state to local. True preemption is something that happens federal to state because you have two sovereign entities. And when you're talking about the federal government preempting the decision-making and policy-making authority of a sovereign entity like a state, I think that's a much different proposition than if you have the state government and local government, because local governments are creatures of the state. So I think when you're saying preemption at the local level, you're not talking about a constitutional issue like you'd be talking about between the federal and the state government. I know a lot of local governments, once the state government got rid of redevelopment agencies, a lot of local governments then hurried up and spent that money in different areas to zero out the budget of the redevelopment agencies before the state government abolished those. And so I think that was kind of a preemption in that manner of speaking, because they were able to take the money and kind of preempt what the state was trying to do by just zeroing out the budget, so the state wasn't getting that money. The whole purpose of getting rid of these agencies was to free up that money so that the state could capture that money. Well, if you go out there and you spend that money as a local government before the state gets rid of your redevelopment agency, you've kind of preempted the objective of the state government. But it's not the constitutional meaning of preemption that we have in relationships between federal and state governments. So I hope that helps answer it. We use terms that, we use terms that are the same term, but they don't mean the same thing when you're talking about a lack of constitutional relationship between state and local governments, as opposed to that constitutional relationship we have between federal and state governments. Good. No, I think those are great questions.
How does the home rule law play into that?
Yeah, because I think once you are a charter government in California, once you have home rule, then you have more control over your budget, you have more control over your elections, you have more control over your system of government. And so when you're a home rule government, the state kind of takes a little step back, as opposed to if you're not a home rule government. I think that just gives you a lot more autonomy over what you do in terms of your budget, your elections, and all those great things. And it's just, if you meet the requirement of being able to be a home rule government, being a charter government, it's usually very much in the best interest of the city to do that, to afford them that additional flexibility.
Thank you, Professor.
Sure, absolutely. Any other questions or observations or anything on all or any of this information that we've covered tonight in terms of the administrative aspects of federalism? And the whole goal of the class is to kind of show you that federalism is just not one monolithic entity, and there are different ways of looking at and interpreting federalism. We can interpret it through a constitutional lens, like we did at the very beginning of our class together. We can look at it through a political lens, like we did a couple of weeks ago. We can look at it through a financial, fiscal lens, like we did last week. We can also look through it, at it through an administrative lens, like we did with the articles for this week. Federalism is a complex topic, and it's oftentimes a misunderstood and overlooked topic. And one of the goals I hope we get from this class is when you leave this class, you look at issues just not from a policy perspective, but you'll also look at them from a federalism and intergovernmental relations perspective as well. And ask those questions about what level of government is doing what roles and responsibilities belong to these different levels of government. And then to be able to make a normative assessment based upon what you understand about federalism, about is that a proper role for the federal government to play, or a proper role for the state or the local government? And I really, if you can kind of frame these issues within a federalism type of perspective, that's kind of what I hope you'll walk away from the class being able to do. But next week, well, again, we'll wrap up administrative aspects with the Paul Posner article. I'll tell you a little bit about Paul and some of the work he did in his career. And then we'll move into our discussion of some of these new and future challenges for American federalism and intergovernmental relations. Okay? Okay, if there's nothing else, then I look forward to reading your article critiques as they come in and reading your Beach Board essay looking at negotiation and bargaining. So I hope everyone has a good remainder of the week. Any questions, feel free to email me. Otherwise, we'll be back at it next Monday and talk about some future challenges to federalism. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening. Talk to you on Monday.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Good night.
Good night.